Today I'm going to show you how to make an amazing loaf of sourdough using malted barley. And this recipe, this one may well have just smashed my old faithful recipe to pieces. It may have taken the top spot. Now don't forget that the full recipe, the method, timelines, details on the malted barley and a printable recipe card are all wrapped up on the recipe blog, which is linked in the video description. And lastly, a massive thank you to Brian, a veteran viewer of the channel, and he kindly sent me out this malted barley to experiment with. So this recipe uses 80% of strong white bread flour. Mine's got a protein content of 13%. We've got 15% of stone ground whole wheat flour and then 5% of malted barley. Our hydration is at 78% and our salt content at 2%. The levain is at 15% and it's 100% hydrated. I'm going to run you through all of the weights as we mix the dough, but just watch this when it all comes together. This produces a beautifully handling dough. Right, here's our malted barley. You should know it's non-diastatic. I'm going to grind this coarsely. Now I'm going to use a grain mill, but you could use a mortar and pestle, you could use a spice grinder or a good old-fashioned rolling pin. But the key is to grind this coarsely. Oh, it smells amazing. There's our coarse ground malted barley. Now this is going to add aroma, flavour, colour, texture, visual interest. Just 5% of this is going to transform our loaf. Right, so first up, I'm going to blend the different flours together in a bowl. I've got 323 grams of our strong white bread flour, and I'm also adding 67 grams of the stone ground whole wheat flour, and of course we've got our 22 grams of cracked malted barley. Now I'm going to dissolve 10 grams of salt into 314 grams of water in another bowl. Now once that's dissolved, I'm going to add in roughly, and just roughly, a quarter of the flour mixture and then blend it into the water. Now when I add the 67 grams of ripe levain, it's going to be easier to mix the two together. Now again, this mixture doesn't need to be smooth, but it does help to disperse that levain well. Now the rest of the flour mixture can be added. This mixture is going to get a really good mix with a spoon, making sure that the sides of the bowl are well cleaned down as we go. We're going to keep mixing this with a spoon until it gets really well combined or it becomes too stiff and you can't mix it any further. Then it's time to wet your hand under the tap and then give the mixture a squeeze for about a minute or so. Now the objective here isn't to make a smooth dough, it's just to make sure that all of the ingredients are really well combined and there's no dry spots of flour. Now once you've developed a shaggy dough like this, clean down the sides of that bowl, cover it, we're going to leave it at room temperature to rest. Now the fermentation process begins at this point. So remember, my kitchen is 25 degrees Celsius today. If your kitchen's cooler, this process is going to take longer. And of course, if your kitchen's warmer, then the process is going to happen quicker. Right, so after our 30-minute rest, it's time to give this mixture a very quick knead. Now its purpose isn't to build strength. I like to think of it as completing the mixing process and just making sure that all of our ingredients are really well incorporated. And in just 30 minutes, you can actually see that this dough has already developed strength and it's still going to continue to ferment for several more hours yet, building more strength. Now, after a minute of turning this dough over, have a good clean up of your hands on the bench and get the dough balled up because it's going to continue to ferment covered at 25 degrees Celsius. Now I like to laminate my dough. I enjoy the process, and in my case I get a really good understanding and feel for what the dough's doing. But if I'm dealing with a larger quantity of dough, I don't have the physical room to laminate, so I stretch it in the container. So you should do whatever works best for you and your situation. Laminate or stretch and fold. Now this first lamination is done 45 minutes after the quick knead, and I'm going to do a total of 3 laminations. The next 2 will also be spaced out with a 45-minute rest in between. Now you don't need to stress too much about the time. As long as you've got at least 30 minutes rest between stretches for the gluten to relax, you should be good. Now I recently switched from a 30 to a 45-minute rest between stretches as my dough responds better because that gluten has more time to relax. Now as ever, after we've finished working with the dough, we're going to bring it into a bowl and we're going to cover it in the bowl and leave it to ferment again at 25 degrees Celsius. Right, this dough has been fermenting for 6 hours in total since mixing. It's had 1 quick knead, followed by 3 laminations, all spaced 45 minutes apart. And it's increased in volume by 75% of its original size. Now, lots of you have asked why I don't always pre-shape my dough. Well, for me, it depends on how the dough feels. If the dough's been proved inside a bowl and it doesn't need dividing and it feels nice and taut, it's already in the perfect shape with the right tension. So I go straight to the final shape. But if I've divided the dough or if it feels loose and slack, I'm going to give it a pre-shape. Now it takes time to get used to this, but once you can read the dough, you'll know what will work best for this shaping procedure in your situation. So I've pulled the dough out into a rough circle and then I fold the sides into the middle. Then I roll the dough into a cylindrical shape that's about the same length as the basket. Now, as I'm shaping the dough, I like to use enough pressure to create tension on the dough without degassing it too much. Finally, I pinch that seam closed and then I dust the dough with rice flour before popping it into my basket seam side down. Now, this is going to prove covered at 25 degrees Celsius. Right, so the sourdough has been proving for 2 hours, and as you can see, it's nicely puffed up. Now, when I poke it, the dough feels expanded, but yet relaxed. It doesn't feel taut like a drum, and it doesn't feel like it's about to collapse either. You know, by feeling the dough, you can gain a really good understanding of when it's about ready to bake, or in this case, cold proof, but it does come with some practice. Now, if you struggle to do it by feel, you can watch and see what the dough is doing. You can gently push the dough with your finger. Now, you don't want that dough to spring back immediately. It should take several relaxed seconds to push back out. Now, this will take time to master, that's for sure. Be patient. I promise you, one day you won't even think about it. Everything's just going to click into place. Now I'm going to place the dough back in the bag, I'm going to flash chill it in the freezer for 30 minutes and then I'm going to pop it straight into the fridge until it's time to bake it tomorrow. Right, so the dough has been cold proving overnight in the fridge for about 13 hours. And I've got to say, I think it looks pretty good. It's nice and puffy with really good surface tension. Now I'm generously going to dust the top of this dough with rice flour and then gently turn it out of the basket onto the bread peel. And I'm going to score the length of the dough. Now look at that dough, it's got this beautiful light orangey tinge from that malted barley. I think this is a beautiful looking dough. Right, so my oven and my baking stone have been preheated to 220 degrees Celsius or 430 degrees Fahrenheit. The oven's set to conventional bake mode, so there's no air circulating, it's just top and bottom heat only. Now the dough's going to bake for 20 minutes covered with a pot, and then after that I'll remove it and it will continue to bake for another 25 minutes. Wow. Oh wow, that smells amazing. And now the hardest bit, I've got to leave this to cool before I can cut into it. So my loaf's been cooling for an hour and a half, a torturous hour and a half, I might add. And while this looks like your standard loaf of sourdough, I promise you it's got so much more to give. My stomach has been growling ever since this came out the oven, so I think it's time to get on to the taste test. So it's great, you've got like this ever so slight burnt orange tinge to the crumb, and then you get these little flecks of malted barley. Oh, the crust is lovely and toasty. I don't know if you've ever eaten a really tangy cheddar that kind of makes your mouth salivate immediately. That's exactly what this is like. On the flavour wheel, it said you get lots of caramel. I can't get that, but it tastes a little bit sweet. It's kind of a background sweetness, which is really nice. So you can get the maltiness coming through. It's not aggressive. It doesn't come up and kind of smack you in the mouth, but it's there. You've got this warm undertone. It transforms this into kind of a winter bread, an autumnal bread. These percentages are nearly the same as my old faithful recipe, but that 5% inclusion of the malted barley changes the flavour profile completely, puts this bread in a different spectrum. So, after last week's video, it sounds like you may want to see my movie night special, that sourdough Detroit pizza. So, I've added it to the video bucket list. Now, don't forget, the sourdough calculator and the recipe are on the website waiting for you. Links down below. A huge thank you for watching. I'm going to see you again very soon, but I want to know what you think to this malted barley recipe and drop me a tag. Stay tuned.